She was just a broke waitress trying to survive another late-night shift until a stalker followed her home and pushed her straight into the arms of the most dangerous man in the city. Lena thought Adrian Voss saved her life, but nah, this guy didn't just scare threats away, he erased them, and here's the real plot twist. She wasn't being hunted for who she was. She was being hunted because of a deadly mistake. One wrong name, one wrong target, and now this girl's entire life gets thrown into a full-blown Mafia revenge game.
Lena Park's choice to seek sanctuary with a stranger was a catastrophic miscalculation of risk. The individual who intervened outside that dilapidated diner was no savior. He was a more sophisticated breed of predator. Adrian Voss didn't merely deter the assailant, he systematically erased him from existence. Now trapped in a transactional reality where mercy is viewed as a systemic failure, Lena faces a psychological crossroads. She must either flee her protector or succumb to a burgeoning Stockholm syndrome within his shadow. Secure this file by engaging with the like button and logging your current coordinates in the comments. Subject's coffee had reached thermal equilibrium an hour ago. Lena Park slid the fractured ceramic toward the counter's edge, her gaze drifting to the clock at 01:47 a.m. 40 minutes remained of a shift defined by compulsive cleaning and the neurological strain of flickering fluorescent tubes. The Moonlight Cafe functioned as a low socioeconomic purgatory of cracked vinyl and stagnant scents. For the subject, however, this grit represented a vital psychological barrier against the trauma of her previous homelessness. To Park, the scent of carbonized bread was preferable to the instability of living in a vehicle. Marcus, the 50-something night cook, attempted a brief check-in. His hands, a map of thermal scarring, moved in rhythm with his habitual humming. The only other variable in the room was old Jerry, a predictable regular who had been nursing a single decaf for 3 hours. A low-risk fixture in a decaying environment. At 2 a.m., the regular would depart, offering his standard, non-verbal pleasantries. Park engaged in displaced activity, scrubbing a sterile counter to manage her rising cortisol levels. It was then she observed the external threat. A male figure positioned in the pawn shop shadows exhibiting a predatory stationary stance. The subject's amygdala triggered a visceral response. She attempted a rationalization, labeling the urban environment as the cause, but the figure's lack of micro-movements suggested a hyper-focus that made her skin crawl. She forced a rhythmic breathing pattern to mask her escalating paranoia. This hypervigilance was a learned survival trait from a volatile upbringing. 5 minutes later, the proximity narrowed. The antagonist was now on the immediate sidewalk. Under the street lamps, his unblinking gaze and sharp features sent the subject's heart into a state of acute tachycardia. Park alerted Marcus, her voice reflecting a significant loss of composure. The cook surveyed the perimeter through the glass, noting the individual by the street lamp. He offered to investigate, but Park's fear-based response led her to decline, despite her obvious lack of belief in her own safety. Marcus's expression mirrored the subject's internal alarm. He proposed a tactical escort to her vehicle. As Jerry exited at 2:15, the stalker breached the inner perimeter, standing near the entrance. Park's fine motor skills failed as she locked the door, her fingers becoming effectively numb from terror. Marcus quietly initiated the egress. They utilized the rear exit, emerging into an alleyway characterized by broken asphalt and urban refuse. The 3-block transit to the employee parking zone felt like an interminable psychological gauntlet for the subject. The pursuer made no further attempt at concealment, maintaining a calculated tactical distance behind them. Marcus urged a faster pace, a command the subject followed with visible tremors. By the time they reached her insecure Honda, Park's physical stability was completely compromised. Marcus assumed a protective, albeit untrained, posture. As Lena fumbled with her keys, a classic stress-induced motor failure, she cursed under her breath. By the time the door was breached, the antagonist had closed the distance to less than 20 feet. Marcus attempted a verbal deterrent, but the stalker merely exhibited a flat, chillingly vacant smile. He addressed the subject by her full name in a monotone voice, asserting a disturbing level of prior surveillance. Marcus stepped into a defensive position, attempting to mediate the looming confrontation. The antagonist reached into his pocket, inducing a state of cognitive freezing in Park. Her mind went void as a mobile device was produced. Not a weapon, yet the psychological threat remained coiled in the air. The tension was palpable, a spectral weight pressing down on the alley. The stalker ignored the cook, focusing his predatory gaze entirely on Lena, claiming he possessed infinite patience. In a sudden subversion of her flight response, Park abandoned her vehicle and sprinted toward a distant source of light, seeking a high-density environment to disrupt the hunter's focus. She sought refuge in an upscale lounge, an environment completely foreign to her socioeconomic status. The sneakers squeaking on marble floors signaled her intrusion into a different world. She gasped out a plea for help, her breathing erratic as she reported the pursuit to the staff. The establishment was nearly void of life, save for the bartender and two high-status males in the corner. As she stammered about her pursuer, one of the men stood. He possessed a physical presence that was both immense and surgically sharp. He was a tall specimen of cold calculation, his expensive attire merely a sheath for a brutal underlying nature. His features were carved from stone, but his eyes were the true anomaly, pale as winter ice and fixed on her with a haunting, analytical intensity. He spoke with a quiet, controlled authority that demanded total attention. When Lena pointed to the entrance, the man investigated with clinical detachment. The street was now a vacuum. The stalker and Marcus had both vanished into the city's indifference. Park insisted on the reality of the threat. The man, Adrian, signaled his associate Victor to conduct a perimeter sweep. As Victor departed without a word, the power dynamic in the room shifted entirely toward the man in the suit. He issued a soft command for her to sit, which functioned as an absolute directive. Park complied, her physiology finally beginning to crash from the adrenaline spike. As she consumed the water provided by the bartender, Adrian remained standing, a weapon in a state of deceptive rest. He observed her with the cold curiosity of a scientist. After she recounted the chase, he confirmed her identity with chilling precision. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She wasn't just being followed, she was being studied by an organized force. When the subject suggested contacting the authorities, Voss dismissed the notion with a haunting certainty. He characterized the police response as a mere administrative formality that would leave her vulnerable to the antagonist's return the following night. Voss presented a minimalist card with an embossed number, a tether for future dependency. He instructed her to call if the approach was repeated. At this stage, he began the process of framing himself as the only viable solution to her existential threat. He identified himself as Adrian Voss. Victor returned, confirming the target had retreated. Adrian's jaw tightened, the only sign of an internal reaction. He informed her the immediate threat had dissipated, though the psychological tension remained at a high baseline. Voss expressed a dark intent to uncover the stalker's motivations. Park experienced a paradoxical sense of security in his presence, a classic cognitive dissonance where a victim perceives a high-level predator as a protective shield. As Park attempted to depart on unstable legs, Voss assumed total control of her transit. He bypassed her objections, delegating Victor as her primary escort. Adrian walked them to the door, his presence effectively neutralizing the fear of the empty streets while replacing it with a deeper, more haunting uncertainty. Subject Park accessed her Honda. Victor performed a clinical sweep of the interior before signaling to Adrian. Park's expression of gratitude was a hollow social reflex. Adrian's mask shifted fractionally. He urged her to keep the contact card close. During the transit, Victor's headlights functioned as a persistent psychological tether in her mirror, vanishing only once she secured her domicile. Sleep was non-existent. Park remained by her window, obsessively manipulating the card. The embossed typography reflected the artificial light of passing traffic, providing a false sense of security. Though she attempted to rationalize that this contact was unnecessary, her instinct recognized the unfolding pathological pattern. The following dawn was somber and unwelcome. The subject navigated her morning routine under a cognitive fog that 2 doses of caffeine failed to lift. Her secondary employment involved medical billing, a soul-crushing exercise in data entry that required her to mimic concern for insurance protocols in exchange for a slightly higher wage. Mid-commute, a digital notification signaled a violent event in the West District. A male was discovered beaten. Police were investigating. Despite irrational warning, Park's fixation compelled her to access the report. The details were clinical. A male was found in a Madison Street alleyway 2 blocks from her workplace at 4 a.m. The trauma was catastrophic. The victim was listed in critical condition at Metro General. No suspects were identified. A low-resolution security image confirmed the victim was the individual in the hoodie. Park's coffee reached room temperature as she lapsed into a dissociative state. She processed the day's work through a veil of automation, her digits blurring against the keyboard. Her lunch hour was spent in digital stasis. At 1400 hours, Marcus initiated contact, his vocal tone strained. He confirmed the identity of the victim from the previous evening. Park admitted that a male had facilitated her safe passage to her vehicle. A silence followed, thick with unvoiced implications. Marcus inquired about the male's identity, his tone suggesting he understood the city's violent hierarchy. He interpreted the beating as a definitive communication from a power player. He warned Park about the high cost of unvetted favors. The analyst notes Marcus's instinctual fear of the megalomaniac narcissist, Adrian. Following the termination of the call, Park stared at her workspace's sterile barriers. The neutralized threat failed to provide relief. Instead, she experienced a profound hollowness. Her return journey was characterized by hypervigilance, frequently checking her mirrors to detect any tailing entities. Her apartment building, a structure of weathered brick and mechanical failures, now felt like a localized zone of trauma. She secured every entry point with obsessive care, engaging the deadbolt and chain. She then retreated to her sofa, her focus fixated entirely on Adrian's card, a potential catalyst for further instability. The logical impulse was to discard the card, yet her hand reached for the vibrating device on an unknown frequency. Adrian's voice was instantly recognizable. When questioned about his source of information, he dismissed the query as irrelevant. The megalomaniac narcissist establishes control by withholding methodology. Adrian pivoted to the operational necessity of a meeting. He revealed that the stalker was merely one component of a larger collective. Park's physiological response was immediate. Adrian refused to discuss specifics over a monitored line, mandating an 8 o'clock meeting at a 5th and Carson establishment. The alternative offered was her death. The threat was delivered with a chilling absence of affect. Adrian hung up, leaving Park in a state of catatonic shock. She was presented with a binary choice: remain in her perceived sanctuary or confront the unknown entity. Neither path offered safety, only the meeting offered agency. The venue deviated from Park's subterranean expectations. It was an upscale bistro, a facade of white linen and soft lighting designed to mask predatory transactions. The contrast between the aesthetic elegance and the underlying violence was a characteristic choice of the megalomaniac narcissist. A hostess greeted Park by name. indicating Adrian's prior orchestration of the environment. Adrian sat in a secluded section, partially obscured by frosted glass. His rise upon her arrival was a display of calculated, archaic etiquette. He acknowledged her compliance with a brief statement of her arrival. Park noted his casual delivery of the death threat. Adrian countered that he merely provides diagnostic observations. He facilitated her seating with cold precision. In the superior lighting, Adrian's features appeared sharper, his gaze possessing a clinical depth that seemed to bypass Park's psychological defenses. Adrian declined to provide transparency regarding his information gathering. He complimented her resilience, labeling it a necessary asset. A waiter performed his function silently. Without consulting the subject, Adrian ordered their meal, a subtle but absolute exertion of dominance over her autonomy. The dialogue shifted to the stalker, identified as David Chen, a low-tier mercenary. Chen was currently hospitalized with catastrophic structural injuries, a violent message written in bone. Adrian's denial of personal involvement was a semantic distinction. He viewed the act as a necessary correction of the environment. Adrian admitted a subordinate performed the task. The revelation settled between them like a diagnostic fact. Park questioned why a high-functioning individual would concern himself with a data entry clerk. Adrian revealed that Chen's interest in her was not a random fixation but a commissioned contract. The revelation caused a shift in Park's equilibrium. Adrian explained she was being monitored for an unknown client. As food was served, Park's appetite vanished, replaced by a visceral reaction to her new status as a target. Adrian admitted to a lack of complete data regarding the motives. Adrian's proposed solution was to utilize his resources to ensure her survival while investigating the threat. Park's reaction was a hysterical laughter, a defense mechanism against the absurdity of her situation. Adrian remained unmoved, eating with clinical precision while Park's reality disintegrated. Park questioned the cost of his intervention. Adrian, amused, invited her to categorize him. He acknowledged his role as a fixer of problems and a phantom in the municipal hierarchy. His self-awareness was consistent with a high-functioning megalomaniac profile. Adrian inquired if his nature elicited fear. He validated this emotion as a survival mechanism. He admitted to managing clandestine operations and generating wealth through methods that would induce psychological distress. He was stripping away her illusions to ensure total dependence. The motivation for his help was a perceived insult to his territory. The enemy had targeted a subject he had claimed. Park attempted to reject this dynamic, asserting she was not his to protect. Adrian countered with absolute certainty. Her autonomy had been voided the moment the conflict began. Adrian dismissed Park's preferences as irrelevant. A telecommunication interrupted the session. His reaction was a minor tightening of the facial muscles. He excused himself to handle the situation at the front of the establishment, leaving Park to observe his rigid silhouette through the glass. Adrian returned with a neutralized expression, though his gaze was sharpened. He reported an attempted breach of her apartment. 2 intruders were intercepted by his surveillance team. The world of Subject Park had officially collapsed. Her sanctuary was no longer secure. Adrian's team had apprehended the subjects for interrogation. He guided Park toward the exit with a firm but impersonal touch. A black sedan was already staged. Victor occupied the pilot's seat, his expression indicating a high-threat environment. Park's transition from victim to asset was nearly complete. As they entered the vehicle, Adrian refused to provide a specific destination, offering only the vague promise of safety. Park considered her dwindling options. She was caught between a known predator and an unknown threat. Her psychological transition into Stockholm Syndrome, beginning its slow, inevitable manifestation. Subject A experienced an acute stress response following a home invasion by two unidentified hostiles. Her cognitive dissonance is evident as she seeks refuge with Subject B, a high-level predatory archetype. As they entered the transport vehicle, her verbalization indicated a desperate need for situational intelligence. Subject B remained emotionally detached, observing the urban landscape. He detailed a catalyst from 3 months ago involving Marcus Liu, a deviant who misappropriated sensitive data. This individual retreated into hiding, leaving behind a biological trail. A daughter, also designated as Lena. Records indicate the biological daughter expired in a vehicular trauma 2 years prior. Subject A displayed rapid cognitive processing of this identity error. Subject B's prognosis remains lethal. He asserts the aggressors will terminate her long before verifying their intelligence failure. The subjects transitioned to a high-security residential zone characterized by architectural austerity and extreme wealth. The glass and concrete structure serves as Subject B's primary base of operations. Subject A correctly identified this sterile environment as his personal habitat. Observation of Subject B reveals a sophisticated layer of social mimicry. His high-value apparel and luxury accessories project the image of a corporate or political leader, effectively masking his true sociopathic functionality from the casual observer. When probed for an identity, Subject B offered a utilitarian definition. He is the primary factor in Subject A's continued biological survival. As they exited the vehicle, the surrounding city continued its pattern of stochastic violence and human error, indifferent to their specific trauma. Subject A has undergone an accelerated introduction to lethal externalities. Upon approaching the residence of Adrienne Voss, she exhibited signs of resigned compliance. The interior environment defied her primitive expectations of power-based aesthetics, lacking any traditional markers of domestic comfort. Rather than traditional displays of dominance, the space reflects Subject B's internal psyche, brutalism and clinical precision. The spatial vacancy and sharp angles mirror his affective flattening and rigid behavioral control. It is an environment designed for observation, not habitation. Subject B discarded his outer layer, revealing a lack of physiological stress. He informed Subject A that her personal assets were already requisitioned by his operatives. This proactive intrusion into her private sphere demonstrates a total disregard for her individual autonomy. Subject A's response to this invasion is characterized by emotional exhaustion rather than resistance. Subject B initiated a ritual of chemical sedation, preparing a beverage to facilitate compliance while dismissing her desire for agency as a secondary concern. Subject B presented a binary survival choice, a classic manipulative strategy. He highlighted the inevitability of the threat to ensure Subject A remains within his controlled perimeter. The hunt for Lauku's daughter is described as an unstoppable mechanical process. The subject's intake of alcohol served as a temporary neurochemical grounding. She sought a temporal framework for her confinement, which Subject B refused to provide. He prioritized biological preservation, framing her existence as a purely tactical problem to be managed. Subject A's internal conflict was suppressed by the reality of her predicament. Her cognitive faculties recognized the futility of resistance within this high-threat environment. She retreated to the designated guest quarters, signaling an increasing reliance on her captor's protection. Subject A attempted to establish a symbolic boundary by inquiring about security locks. Subject B responded with disturbing honesty, asserting that no physical barrier could impede his access. He concluded the session with a directive for sleep, maintaining his dominant position. The subject occupied a guest chamber, reflecting the house's overall sensory deprivation. The minimalist furniture and white linens provided no psychological comfort. She observed a garden through the glass, though her perception remained limited by the external darkness. Meticulous organization of her belongings indicates a high degree of surveillance and logistical planning. Despite the futility of the gesture, she engaged the security lock before collapsing into a state of hypervigilant insomnia, haunted by the looming threat of mistaken identity. Her subconscious processed the traumatic stimuli of the evening throughout her sleep cycle. She woke to the olfactory trigger of coffee, a grounding element that signaled her continued integration into Subject B's highly structured and dangerous world. Subject B was observed in the kitchen, maintaining a state of relaxed vigilance. He performed the task of beverage preparation with the same mechanical precision he applies to all tactical operations. He provided a cup to Subject A without emotional inflection. Consumption patterns show Subject B prefers unadulterated stimulants. He initiated a brief assessment of Subject A's nocturnal recovery before she pivoted the dialogue toward the status of the apprehended hostiles. Her focus remains fixed on the source of the threat. Subject B confirmed the suspects are undergoing aggressive interrogation by specialists. He dismissed the moral implications of physical coercion, citing the operational norms of his violent social stratum. Subject A struggled to maintain her ethical framework in the face of this reality. The subject's moral outrage is currently being superseded by her self-preservation instinct. Subject C entered the area, his physiological markers indicating a transition to heightened aggression. He delivered a report in a foreign tongue, likely Russian, prompting a visible reaction from Subject B. Intelligence received 20 minutes prior initiated a shift in Subject B's demeanor. He reviewed digital data on a tablet, his expression hardening into a state of cold calculation. The information appears to represent a significant escalation in the external conflict. Visual evidence shows a thermal incident at Subject A's primary residence. The presence of carbon scoring and structural damage indicates a deliberate firebombing. This act of arson serves as a powerful psychological message from the pursuing entity. The event occurred at 4:00 hours with 0 collateral fatalities. Subject A's motor control failed, resulting in the destruction of property. She realized the antagonists are willing to utilize indiscriminate violence to achieve their objectives, regardless of her presence. The arson is classified as psychological warfare intended to demonstrate lethal intent. Subject A's physical tremors indicate an acute trauma response. She attempted to project the culpability for this escalation onto Subject B's interference in the situation. Subject B utilized a logic-based rebuttal, asserting that his intervention prevented her immediate termination. He reframed her status from passive victim to an active participant with a chance at retribution, a common tactic used to foster loyalty in Stockholm-type scenarios. Subject B distinguished between primitive revenge and systematic resolution. He views the elimination of the threat as a clinical necessity. His megalomaniac tendencies are visible in his desire for a clean, permanent, and satisfying conclusion to the tactical error. A nonverbal exchange with Subject C prompted Subject B's departure for a field confrontation. He restricted Subject A's movement to the compound for her safety. She attempted to assert her autonomy, but her demands were summarily dismissed by his authority. Subject B utilized physical proximity to exert dominance, radiating a predatory intensity. He cautioned Subject A against witnessing his interrogation methods, implying that the reality of his conversations would cause irreversible damage to her psychological well-being. Rapport remains at 0%. My observation of the subject reveals a sharp intellect, yet her resistance is crumbling. He exited the frame before a verbal response was possible. Victor maintained his post at the threshold, a study in psychological immovability. Lena's gaze drifted across the debris, the shattered ceramic, the digital feed of her incinerated residence. witnessing the total annihilation of her reality, both literal and existential. "Is there a protocol for sanitation?" she inquired. Victor signaled his consent, facilitating her need for a displacement activity by providing a broom. The subsequent hours displayed the characteristic stretching of time during high-stress confinement. She attempted to engage with the television, a failed distraction. She attempted bibliotherapy, but the syntax fractured before her eyes. Mostly she exhibited restless pacing within the antiseptic vacuum of Adrian's domicile, desperate to avoid analyzing the absolute conviction in his vocal patterns. Victor shadowed her with non-invasive proximity, a constant peripheral presence. At 1200 hours, he prepared nourishment, a sandwich displaying a precision discordant with his history of physical trauma infliction. "State your tenure with him," Lena prompted. Victor processed the query. 7 years. Is he perpetually like this? Define this absolute certainty about the external world. Mr. Voss views ambiguity as a cognitive failure, a luxury his survival instinct prohibits. Such a lifestyle suggests chronic psychological exhaustion, yet it serves as his primary defense mechanism. Lena consumed her meal, pondering the neural pathways required for such unrelenting vigilance. She questioned what Adrian had done to warrant such extreme protective measures. He returned at 15 hours and 0 minutes. The auditory stimulus of the engine preceded the vocal exchange in the foyer. Upon her descent, she observed Adrian performing a ritualistic cleansing of blood from his hands at the sink. "Are you injured?" The inquiry was an autonomic empathy response she couldn't suppress. "Negative." "Then who's?" "A subject who possessed the data I required." He decontaminated his hands and rotated toward her. A solitary crimson specimen remained on his collar, unnoticed by the predator. Lena became fixated on that single anomaly in his otherwise meticulously curated persona. "Provide the findings," she commanded. The hit on the daughter of Marcus Liu originated from Vincent Zhao. He manages human trafficking within the maritime sector. Marcus engaged in a high-stakes theft, securing a ledger containing evidence sufficient for 3 life sentences. He erroneously concludes I am the current possessor. He hypothesized that Marcus transferred the asset to his offspring post-mortem. Discovering a Lena Park operating within the same nocturnal radius led to a catastrophic cognitive bias. Zhao is a personality type that refuses to acknowledge fallibility. He will persist in his predatory behavior until he is satisfied that his objective is unattainable. Lena collapsed into a chair, her posture indicating defeat. "The proposed resolution." "We present him with empirical evidence." "I possess nothing." Adrian revealed a digital image on his device. It depicted an archaic, leather-bound volume, the stolen ledger. "My operatives recovered this from its concealment." "The methodology." "The individual I interrogated this afternoon became highly compliant once his survival options were clarified. Marcus had archived the asset in a metropolitan storage unit. We secured it 2 hours ago. My intent is to utilize this as absolute leverage to ensure your permanent safety." There was that terrifying conviction again, the megalomaniacal belief that the fabric of reality would reorder itself simply because he willed it so. "And if he disregards the leverage," Lena countered, "if his objective remains my termination, then I shall terminate him first." He stated this with the casual affect of someone discussing meteorology, as if homicide were merely another administrative task. "You cannot simply—" "I can, I have," and I will execute that protocol again if the situation mandates it. This is your new ecological niche, Miss Park. Survival scales with your speed of acceptance. She felt the impulse to provide a moral counter-argument, but the visual evidence of her incinerated home and the blood on his hands silenced her. This was his true psychological profile. Currently, this man was the only barrier between her and total annihilation. The timeline, she asked? For the exchange. Tonight. A summit is scheduled. Jiao believes he is purchasing your coordinates. Instead, I am presenting a divergent proposition. I am participating in this operation. Denied. Absolutely. You stated it yourself. I am already integrated into this environment. I should observe its mechanics. Adrian scrutinized her. Then, a rare facial micro-expression. A smile. It momentarily deactivated his predatory mask, making him appear almost humanoid. Your profile suggests either extreme fortitude or a lack of self-preservation, Miss Park. The distinction is often negligible. He signaled to Victor, the silent observer. Equip her with tactical attire. Include a ballistic vest. A vest, Lena echoed. A safeguard against projectiles. How reassuring. Despite the sarcasm, she complied as Victor escorted her to select clothing that would mask her civilian status in the criminal underworld. 60 minutes later, she was encased in dark denim and a structured jacket, creating a more formidable aesthetic. The ballistic layer beneath was deceptively light, though its functional purpose induced a somatic nausea. Adrian entered, his blood-contaminated garment replaced by a pristine one. Are you prepared? Negative. An honest assessment. The transit to the harbor sector spanned 40 minutes. Lena observed the urban decay through the glass, the affluent sectors of Adrian's territory dissolving into the entropic industrial zones where the infrastructure was failing. Marcus's hunting grounds, Adrian noted. His primary error, besides the theft. He suffered from a cognitive bias regarding his own intelligence. He believed he could leverage a predator for a superior existence. Instead, he triggered his daughter's termination and ended his own cycle in isolation. If he survived, his biological drive to reclaim the ledger would have manifested by now. Certain values transcend mere biological survival. The vehicle entered a derelict maritime facility. Oxidized containers were scattered like forgotten psychological blocks. The atmosphere was saturated with salt and decomposition. 3 vehicles were already positioned. Maintain proximity to Victor, Adrian directed. In the event of kinetic engagement, he is your extraction point. If the firing commences, our survival probability is 0. Likely, but let us aim for a peaceful resolution. He exited with a stillness that suggested a meditative state. Lena followed, her motor skills hindered by tremors. Victor was the solid anchor at her rear. The men waiting exhibited typical predatory markers, hardened visages, expensive tailoring masking high-caliber weaponry. One subject approached, approximate age 60, silver-haired, exhibiting signs of chronic ultraviolet exposure. Vincent Zhao. A companion, Zhao observed, his phonetics slightly accented. Quite an anomaly. Meet Lena Park, Adrian introduced. The target of your recent assassination attempts. Zhao's facial muscles remained static. I lack data on that subject. False. You have full knowledge of the breach of her domicile, the incendiary device, in the contract on Marcus's daughter. That individual is deceased. Correct. This is a different subject. For the first time, Zhao's ocular focus shifted to Lena. She resisted the urge to exhibit a flint response. Your purpose here? Jiao inquired. You committed a tactical error, and such errors necessitate repercussions. Adrian produced the ledger. Jiao's pupils dilated, a micro-expression of shock. Synthesize this information carefully, Adrian said. This archive documents your entire operational history. Names, logistical routes, financial transfers. Enough to ensure your total institutionalization. I could hand this to the authorities or your rivals. Or I can incinerate it now and we achieve a neutral resolution. Your requirements? Permanent cessation of hostilities against her. You will broadcast that Lena Park is an untouchable entity. Do this, and the evidence is neutralized. If you decline, every federal bureau receives a package tomorrow morning, and the following night, I will personally terminate your existence. The subsequent silence was a total sensory vacuum. Jiao analyzed the ledger and the tactical tension of the surrounding subjects. Lena could sense the lethal energy in the environment, poised for a violent release. Verification of authenticity, Jiao demanded. Adrian opened the volume and recited sensitive data points. With every data point, Jiao's psychological state darkened. Are you satisfied? I am inviting you to be pragmatic. I am offering a resolution that bypasses a lethal outcome. This is a level of clemency you rarely encounter. Another protracted silence. Jiao signaled his compliance. The subject is yours. The word will be disseminated. Ensure compliance, because if any harm reaches her, this contract is voided. And I assure you, Vincent, the terminal phase of that scenario is something you wish to avoid. Jiao's jaw muscles spasmed, yet he offered no verbal resistance. He gestured for his unit to withdraw. Lena's respiratory system didn't return to a normal rhythm until the facility was in the rear view. Is that the conclusion? She asked. He just submitted? He complied because he is smart enough to recognize a superior tactical position. He understands consequences. I simply provided a vivid map of his own destruction. Lena observed the record book remaining in Adrian's possession, serving as a behavioral safeguard against Jiao's potential betrayal. Incineration was illogical. In this sociopathic environment, collateral is primary currency for survival. She accepted this clinical truth with a hushed expression of gratitude. His expression remained a clinical blank as he dismissed her thanks. Resolving this singular crisis failed to address the systemic contamination of her psyche. She had witnessed the operational reality of a predator. Such exposure is irreversible. The mundane life she once occupied had been thoroughly extinguished. She questioned her future path as they navigated the urban landscape in total silence. The transition from industrial decay to residential order mirrored her internal psychic shift. Lena felt a profound sense of displacement, as if her moral compass had permanently realigned toward the encroaching shadows. Upon returning to the residence, he maintained a professional distance, directing her to recover while postponing further analysis until the next day. However, Lena remained stationary in the sterile environment of his living room. She declared her refusal to revert to her previous insignificant social identity. The monotonous cycle of data entry and isolation no longer sufficed. She rejected the invisibility of her former self, craving significance within this dangerous hierarchy. Despite the inherent risks of associating with a megalomaniac narcissist, she preferred the threat of violence over the vacuum of her old existence. Her motivations lacked a clear academic definition, yet the impulse was undeniable. It was a physical manifestation of the power dynamics she had witnessed, his absolute dominance over Chen and the tactical intimidation of Jiao. She was drawn to the raw authority he exerted over their violent world. Her ultimate desire was the eradication of her own vulnerability. She differentiated between mere biological breathing and the actual sensation of being alive. Adrian's rare, haunting smile suggested he found her psychological complexity engaging as he closed the physical distance between them, intensifying her physiological response. The scent of his expensive fragrance permeated the small space. If she stayed, the paradigm would shift irrevocably. He claimed her as a personal asset, his to defend and possess. While this overt display of dominance should have triggered a flight response, it instead activated a deep visceral arousal. He traced her jawline with a phantom touch, welcoming her to the metaphorical depths of his world. It was a warning against psychic drowning. Adrian then retreated into his habitual mask of stoic control. That night, Lena left her door unlocked, signaling her total submission to the environment. The following morning brought the clinical reality of consequences. Adrian was already operational, engaged in a clipped, aggressive dialogue in Russian. His disheveled appearance suggested a night of high-functioning stress, lending a brief, deceptive layer of humanity to his otherwise cold, calculating exterior persona. He provided her coffee, demonstrating a calculated memory for her preferences. The contract on her life had been retracted, yet her association with him had triggered a cascade of inquiries within the criminal underground. Her presence was now a variable that the surrounding predators were seeking to quantify. The nature of their bond remained an undefined psychological anomaly. Victor interrupted with a report of an escalating crisis that required immediate intervention. Adrian's physical reaction, a tightening of the jaw, indicated the severity of the data displayed on the tablet as he processed the new threat. 4 casualties were confirmed, with the potential for more. A silent exchange of tactical information passed between the men. Adrian attempted to confine Lena to the safety of the house, but she challenged his unilateral decision, refusing to be excluded from the reality of their shared environment. She insisted on being integrated into his world, rejecting his attempts to shield her. Adrian's composure fractured as he revealed the lethal stakes. 4 of his subordinates were ambushed, resulting in 2 immediate fatalities. His reluctance to add her to the body count was a rare emotional leak. The news acted as a psychological shock. Lena realized her existence was now inextricably linked to this systemic violence. Everything had become a symptom of her proximity to him. As he prepared to depart, the weight of her culpability in these deaths began to settle into her consciousness. She offered a futile warning for him to be cautious, which he dismissed as the very trait that led to his men's demise. Left in the silence of the house, Lena experienced the crushing onset of a trauma bond, feeling the burden of 4 lives sacrificed for her continued protection. The day was a study in agonizing anticipation. Victor remained a stoic sentinel, his darkening expression reflecting the grim updates received via his device. By midday, Lena demanded transparency, unable to endure the psychological isolation of not knowing the extent of the unfolding bloodshed. Victor maintained a detached, professional perspective on the fatalities, categorizing them as impersonal business losses. However, Lena recognized that Adrian had disrupted this clinical detachment by making her protection a personal priority. The warehouse ambush was a targeted strike facilitated by a calculated betrayal. The certainty of an internal leak pointed to a profound breach of loyalty within the organization. When Lena questioned the traitor's fate, Victor's response was chillingly predictable. The inevitable application of lethal force was simply a law of physics in their world, a clean, necessary elimination of a threat. Adrian returned at dusk, his physical form bearing the marks of recent violence and his eyes reflecting a cold, predatory focus. He bypassed communication, retreating to the bathroom to address his injuries. Lena waited exactly 10 minutes before intervening, allowing him a brief moment of private recovery. She found him standing before the mirror, shirtless and scarred, a physical record of a life defined by conflict. His body was a tool of his trade, marked by both old trauma and fresh bruises. He offered a dark, deflective joke about the condition of his opponent, who was no longer breathing. Lena stepped into the clinical space of the bathroom, insisting on treating his wounds despite his dismissive claims of being fine. She utilized the first aid supplies with methodical precision. Adrian observed her through the mirror, his gaze a complex mixture of exhaustion and unreadable psychological depth. She asserted a brief moment of dominance, cleaning the laceration on his face while observing the profound fatigue etched into his features. When asked if the traitors had been neutralized, he confirmed their elimination with a chilling finality, having successfully purged the source of the organization's instability. She tended to his damaged knuckles with clinical care, ignoring his suggestion that any rational person would have fled by now. By identifying herself as an outlier to normal human behavior, she solidified her place beside him, affirming her psychological compatibility with his violent, high-stakes reality. Their proximity created a volatile emotional tension. In the gray of his eyes, she saw the precise moment his internal inhibitors failed. When he spoke her name, it carried the weight of a diagnostic warning, acknowledging that crossing this threshold would result in a permanent psychological transformation. She rejected the possibility of retreat, prompting a desperate, primal kiss that shattered his remaining self-regulation. It was a collision of blood, antiseptic, and raw desire. As they caught their breath, the facade of the cold professional was briefly replaced by a man drowning in his own complexity. He attempted a moment of moral lucidity, labeling their intimacy a mistake and confessing to a history of sickening acts. Lena refused his paternalistic attempts to decide her worth. She claimed her own agency, demanding that he stop projecting his guilt onto her choices as she pulled him back. The subsequent embrace was more deliberate, a sensory exploration of their newfound connection. Later, in the quiet aftermath, Lena traced the jagged scar on his torso, a permanent physical manifestation of a blade's path, contemplating the violent history that now dictated the rhythm of her own life. Blade trauma, 5 years ago, shattered his adolescent narcissistic invulnerability. Attachment is a liability. Subject L is his primary vulnerability. Subject A admits pathological insomnia-driven dependency cured only by her. Subject L exhibits co-regulation, synchronizing nervous systems via rhythmic vitals. 3 weeks of mimicry normalized the surrounding lethal blood trauma. She maps his infrastructure, seeking logic within his megalomania. Sociopathic subordinates view Subject L as a high-risk structural anomaly. Branding behavior confirms Subject L is experiencing profound Stockholm syndrome. A Tuesday ambush exposes Subject L's fragility within this ecosystem. Subject L displayed a textbook freeze response during tactical execution. Scalp trauma and gunfire dragged her to the brink of termination. Victor neutralized threats clinically. Subject L displayed acute stress tremors. Paranoid hyperfixation led Subject A to correctly triple her security. Saturated in viscera, the megalomaniac narcissist acknowledges his singular weakness. He ruminates on 3 seconds, his ego control disintegrating completely. Subject A fears loss. Subject L offers a carpe diem sedative. Subject A utilizes a marital contract as a strategic deterrent. He demands marriage with desperation, seeking a tactical survival defense. Marriage signifies total war, transforming her into his untouchable armor. Subject L's physical collapse signifies total surrender to the bond. Subject A offers a diamond, tethering her to his violence. Stockholm syndrome confirmed. She mistakes possessive drowning for affection. A 24-hour deadline finalizes Subject A's absolute psychological ownership. Fear is channeled into aggressive underworld territorial marking and threats. Subject L is now a prized asset within his cage. Anonymity is replaced by lethal significance in the subject's world. Security notes a dangerous anomaly, the subject's humanization via fear. Power structures shift, placing her at the epicenter. The subject exhibits defensive posturing. He utilizes the threat of scorched earth retaliation to secure the patient's psychological compliance. Their union was codified in a secular legal setting at precisely 12 noon the following day. Witnesses were limited to 2 associates, Victor and Diana. The ritual lacked traditional aesthetic markers. No white garments, no floral arrangements, only a functional gray dress for Lena. The proceeding concluded in 7 minutes, finalized by a kiss that mirrored a biological covenant. The exchange of precious metals followed. Adrian's vocalization of ownership was not an inquiry but a definitive diagnostic claim. Lena's response confirms the onset of profound psychological bonding. External logistics remained fluid, with communication networks already processing the new hierarchy. Victor's congratulatory remark lacked genuine empathy, but possessed a rare tonal warmth. The couple transitioned to a high-security culinary facility, a venue requiring 6 months of prior clearance. Adrian's influence superseded standard social protocols. The environment was sterilized of other patrons. To Lena, this was a reception. To Adrian, it was merely biological refueling. Social celebrations are deferred until the threat landscape stabilizes. The patient's cognitive functions remained overstimulated by the persistent atmosphere of peril. After less than 30 days of exposure, the patient is legally bound to an apex predator. Despite his history of lethal force, she perceives his aggression as a protective mechanism. Her internal assessment of the megalomaniac narcissist yields 0 evidence of buyer's remorse. A brief smile from the subject appears to validate her traumatic bonding. They retreated to the primary residence, now a shared psychological space. Adrian initiated a series of commands, restructuring his criminal ecosystem to accommodate the new variable. By nightfall, the rebranding of Lena Park as Lena Voss was complete. She now occupies an untouchable status within the social strata. Adrian anticipates at least one individual will attempt to challenge this new boundary, driven by cognitive dissonance or overconfidence. The subject plans to utilize exemplary violence to maintain order. Lena's lack of horror suggests a total assimilation into the perpetrator's worldview. She has transitioned from a victim of circumstance to a willing participant in the defensive structure of the narcissist. Their nocturnal intimacy was characterized by a heightened awareness of mortality. 6 days of relative stasis followed before the anticipated environmental rupture occurred. However, the catalyst for the conflict was an unforeseen fraternal element. While the patient performed a domestic task, Victor exhibited signs of acute autonomic arousal. He demanded immediate contact with Adrian. The subject was found in his command center, already alerted to the breach in his security perimeter. Adrian confirmed the update. His brother, Victor, had returned. Legally deceased for 3 years, the sibling had materialized at the airport with 12 combatants. Security imaging revealed a variant of Adrian possessing a higher baseline for overt hostility. The elder sibling displayed a more primal, unrefined aggression. Adrian's tone, while clinical, revealed the depths of their previous fratricidal conflict. The death of the brother was a paid deception that has now failed. Victor's criminal profile includes high-level human trafficking and scorched earth extortion. Adrian's attempt to neutralize him via assassination failed, leading to a period of tactical exile. The current breach suggests a failure in the financial containment strategy. Diana arrived, fully mobilized for combat. The elder brother is moving to reclaim the territorial assets he believes are his by birthright. He views Adrian's ascension as a psychological injury nurtured over 3 years of isolation. The objective is total acquisition, the empire and the wife. Adrian's gaze suggests a grim realization of the stakes. While the marriage remains a classified variable, the siblings' confrontation is inevitable and likely to be catastrophic. A debate regarding tactical transparency ensued. Adrian refused to obfuscate Lena's status, citing the failure of previous half measures. He opted for a direct confrontation, rejecting the advice of his subordinates who feared the elder brother's reaction. The subject differentiated the siblings. Adrian utilizes calculated precision, while Victor is driven by uninhibited appetites. This distinction is critical for the patient's understanding of the imminent threat. Victor lacks any semblance of a moral or a professional code. Fear is a logical response to such a predator. Adrian's strategy involves a preemptive strike on neutral ground to leverage social witnesses. Despite the tactical risk, the move was initiated with the cold efficiency of a surgical strike. At 12 noon, they arrived at a neutral establishment. The environment was intended to inhibit ballistics, though it offered no psychological safety. Adrian maintained possessive physical contact with Lena, an unconscious signal of territorial dominance. The subject detailed the family's fractured lineage, the legitimate son versus the elevated mistress's child. Victor's resentment is rooted in this perceived biological hierarchy. In his reality, Adrian's very existence is the primary transgression. The father prioritized Adrian's controlled narcissism over Victor's pyromanic tendencies. The elder brother's return signifies a 3-year cycle of resource accumulation and vengeful planning. They reached the venue, an establishment practiced in the art of professional silence. The proprietor greeted them with a neutral affect. Inside, Victor was positioned as the central figure of a 12-man court. The encounter began with a clinical exchange of pleasantries that barely masked the underlying homicidal intent. Victor utilized a condescending diminutive when addressing his brother. Adrian responded with a rejection of social pretense. The elder's attention shifted to Lena, categorizing her through a lens of objectification and transactional value. Adrian confirmed her status as wife, a revelation that functioned as a psychological explosive. Victor's reaction was a mix of amusement and analytical curiosity regarding Adrian's capacity for domestic commitment. He views the relationship as an anomaly. Victor circled the patient like a scavenger, dismissing her aesthetic value while contemplating the potential for psychological corruption. Adrian's counter-threat was met with a dismissal of his spinal capacity for lethal action. The brothers debated the philosophy of power. Adrian argued for the utility of restraint, whereas Victor viewed it as a fatal pathology. The elder predator then redirected his focus back to Lena to begin his psychological interrogation. L interrogated A's history, specifically the 47 South District casualties. A terminated the inquiry. Megalomaniac narcissist. Victor threatened Lena. Adrian responded with sudden protective physical aggression. Physical confrontation ensued until neutral intervention. Adrian suppressed his violent impulses, maintaining order. Victor mocked Adrian's perceived emasculation, claiming stolen birthright during their clinically tense confrontation. The syndicate chose Adrian for stability. Victor demanded a chaotic, total power transition. Victor's 48-hour ultimatum revealed sociopathic traits. Lena observed the incipient carnage. Adrian threatened scorched earth retaliation regarding Lena. Victor remained dismissive of the clinical warning. Post-confrontation, Adrian displayed psychological fatigue, admitting to mass casualty arson for strategic gain. Adrian justified mass murder as utilitarian necessity. Lena experienced cognitive dissonance while maintaining loyalty. Tactical mobilization commenced. Adrian leveraged loyalties while the syndicate awaited an inevitable victor. Victor's bribes induced defections, prioritizing short-term greed over long-term sustainable survival. Lena analyzed the criminal infrastructure, observing the clinical precision of Adrian's socioeconomic control. Sleep deprivation induced hypervigilance. Lena forced a breakthrough, demanding Adrian share his fears. Adrian acknowledged Victor's ruthlessness, contemplating a total psychological and physical life reset. Adrian prioritized Lena's safety. She insisted on partnership, exhibiting symptoms of Stockholm Syndrome. Lena demanded partnership. They identified 3 neutral families as the necessary psychological tipping point. Strategy shifted to collaborative partnership, a model successful for over 3 years. Lena's transition from victim to strategist intensified during the drafting of sophisticated proposals. 2 factions capitulated. The Kozlovs demanded a high-risk meeting, suggesting a potential ambush. Lena asserted her presence at the warehouse. Adrian accepted her as a partner. Patriarch Alexei observed Lena, noting the integration of personal and professional spheres. Adrian defended Lena's status. Alexei challenged Adrian's perceived softness, influenced by Victor's propaganda. Adrian argued that softness facilitates sustainable survival, contrasting it with lethal, open warfare. Victor's promises of territory were dismissed as unsustainable chaos by an observant Adrian. Alexei demanded premiums. Lena intervened, identifying the demand as a psychological test. Lena categorized Victor as chaos, framing Adrian as the only path for stability. Alexei noted Lena's transformation from mouse to lioness, granting a follow-up consultation. The stalemate ended in a diplomatic opening. Victor's megalomaniac narcissism remained a factor. Subject Adrian diagnosed. Subject Lena's negotiation tactics as clinically impulsive upon their departure. While the auxiliary Victor validated this assessment, Adrian maintained a cold, paternalistic dominance over his tactical discourse. The subsequent consultation with Subject Alex achieved systemic equilibrium. Subject Adrian anticipated Subject Victor's emotional instability would lead to a catastrophic behavioral lapse, which manifested exactly 48 hours later. Subject Victor utilized 3 cadavers as a symbolic communique to signal a total psychological break. Adrian's response was a study in frozen detachment, initiating 72 hours of high-intensity territorial attrition. Subject Adrian executed a clinical liquidation of the opposition's logistical assets and human capital. As the regional underworld braced for impact, Subject Lena experienced the isolating effects of a high-security containment environment. Subject Victor's pathology escalated to the desecration of the paternal monument. At 3 o'clock in the morning, the biological siblings engaged in a terminal confrontation stripped of all external defensive variables. The verbal exchange revealed Subject Victor's deep-seated resentment regarding his perceived paternal rejection. He framed the conflict as a struggle against systemic exclusion, while Adrian identified Victor's inherent volatility as his undoing. Subject Victor attempted to reassert dominance through a primitive display of unarmed combat. Subject Adrian accepted this invitation to physical trauma, disregarding Subject Lena's vocalized manifestations of acute anxiety. Despite the high probability of a fatal outcome, Subject Lena remained a witness to this fraternal liquidation. Subject Adrian rationalized the forthcoming violence as a necessary deterrent to prevent further civilian casualties. The physical altercation lacked all technical refinement, devolving into a primal exchange of blunt force trauma. Subject Adrian suffered a significant neurological blow, providing Subject Victor with a perceived window for a terminal strike. Utilizing kinetic momentum, Subject Adrian regained a dominant tactical position. Both subjects exhibited extreme physiological exhaustion, yet Adrian maintained a potentially lethal cervical restraint, forcing a final psychological evaluation. Subject Adrian offered a non-lethal exit strategy, yet Subject Victor's megalomania precluded the possibility of surrender. A brief moment of vestigial humanity flickered before Victor's self-destructive impulses fully reasserted their dominance. Subject Victor induced a self-dislocation of the shoulder to bypass the restraint, subsequently introducing a concealed firearm. However, subject Lena intervened, neutralizing the threat with a single discharge from 10 feet away. Subject Lena had secured the weapon covertly, her motor functions overriding her conscious hesitation at the moment of Adrian's projected expiration. The projectile impacted Victor's shoulder, terminating his offensive capabilities immediately. Subject Adrian informed the wounded subject that his entire support structure had been systematically co-opted or destroyed. Subject the Victor's delusions of loyalty were clinically dissected and replaced with the reality of total isolation. Faced with the absolute collapse of his agency, Subject Victor observed the cold resolve in Subject Lena's gaze. Subject Adrian utilized her demonstrated lethality as a permanent psychological deterrent to ensure Victor's compliance. Subject Victor acknowledged his lack of viable alternatives before retreating into the periphery. Subject Adrian categorized this as the first rational decision made by the subject during the entire observed conflict. Following the auditory trauma of the gunshot, subject Lena experienced a predictable post-acute physiological collapse. The auxiliary Diana facilitated their extraction as the localized law enforcement response was projected to be imminent. Subject Victor's departure signaled the total disintegration of his power base. Subject Adrian's decision to grant mercy was interpreted by the regional network as a sign of supreme psychological and structural dominance. The surviving criminal elements performed acts of submissive realignment. Meanwhile, subject Lena entered a period of intense cognitive processing regarding her transition from a passive observer to an active violent participant. Subject Lena questioned the potential for psychological desensitization to violence. Subject Adrian countered by positioning her as his moral anchor, essential for preventing his own descent into a purely megalomaniacal state. Subject Lena's self-analysis revealed a profound metamorphosis. The persona characterized by invisibility and fear had been completely replaced by an integrated, high-status member of a sophisticated criminal hierarchy. 14 days post-conflict, subject Lena began presenting symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. These episodes were characterized by vivid nocturnal flashbacks and phantom sensations related to the weight of the firearm. Subject Adrian provided consistent grounding during these episodes, framing her actions through a lens of survival necessity. He posited that her cognitive architecture would eventually integrate the trauma into a new, stronger identity. The regional power vacuum was methodically filled as Subject Adrian restructured the hierarchy. This process involved the strategic redistribution of territories and the termination of captains whose loyalty remained statistically questionable. Subject Lena adapted to the high-stakes behavioral mathematics of her new environment. Her participation in negotiations was met with heightened deference, as the peer group perceived her as a dangerous and unpredictable variable. Auxiliary Diana noted that subject Lena's perceived unpredictability generated more profound fear than subject Adrian's calculated violence. In the criminal subconscious, the unknown actor is always the most significant psychological threat. 90 days after the cemetery incident, subject Adrian initiated a profound shift in his operational philosophy. He proposed the total cessation of all exploitation-based revenue streams, specifically targeting human trafficking and labor camps. This decision represented a significant fiscal sacrifice of tens of millions. Subject Adrian admitted that his proximity to subject Lena had rendered these predatory business models psychologically and morally incompatible with his new identity. Adrian's psychological profile shows a sudden fracture in his cognitive dissonance. He has effectively terminated his complicity in organized exploitation, prioritizing moral recalibration over profit. The syndicate's disapproval is irrelevant. He is no longer seeking their validation. He has initiated high-stakes cooperation with federal intelligence. The subject is orchestrating a strategic trade, Vittorio's entire infrastructure for localized immunity. Lena's reaction suggests she had not fully mapped his capacity for such a radical, pragmatic pivot. Adrian justifies this pact as a humanitarian intervention, though his underlying motivations remain clinically complex. This systemic behavioral transformation required a 6-week period of intense negotiation. By functioning as a confidential informant, Adrian's persona shifted from autocratic leader to government asset. Lena observed this slow erosion of his criminal identity during their most intimate private interactions. While reviewing incriminating digital data, the subject admitted his primary driver is the preservation of Lena's perception of him. He is desperate to avoid her eventual psychological repulsion. He is actively attempting to overwrite his established criminal archetype through a conscious, self-determined choice. On a Tuesday morning, coordinated federal intervention resulted in the apprehension of 37 targets. This operation stands as the most significant disruption of exploitation networks in regional history. Despite his instrumental role, Adrian's involvement remains clinically redacted from all public narratives and reports. Adrian views the destruction of his assets as a necessary amputation to preserve the organizational core. He communicated his detachment from the exploitation industry to the aggrieved syndicates with chilling finality. He has effectively removed his protective umbrella, leaving former allies exposed to systemic risks. This was a calculated risk, leveraging the secondary family's deep-seated dependence on his infrastructure. Alexei Kozlov's public endorsement reflects a collective realization that human trafficking was an unsustainable liability. The consensus shifted toward survivalist pragmatism over short-term revenue. The prevailing sentiment was to accept these terms rather than face total federal eradication. Dissenting factions were met with systematic exclusion and territory reallocation. Within 6 months of the predecessor's removal, the hierarchy had been completely re-engineered into a more efficient, focused model. The resulting entity is streamlined and operates with an unprecedented degree of legitimacy. The subject dismisses his father's legacy with a clinical indifference, preferring modern strategy over traditional violence. Adrian has successfully transitioned from a direct executor of force to a detached, high-level strategist. The acquisition of a rural estate marks an attempt to establish a non-combative environment. This location serves as a psychological sanctuary for a future devoid of criminal utility. He acknowledges the statistical improbability of a positive outcome for a subject with his specific history. They initiated a cycle of weekend excursions to simulate civilian life and domestic normalcy. Lena's unsuccessful attempts at gardening highlight her lack of domestic training, while Adrian's perfectly aligned fencing reflects his inherent need for control. They are currently testing the boundaries of a regular existence. While observing the sunset, the pair engaged in a discussion regarding their authentic identity. Lena proposed a continuation of their charade as average citizens. Adrian, however, expressed a psychological yearning for this simulation to become his authentic reality, moving beyond mere performance. 2 months later, a biological variable altered the trajectory of the case. Lena was pregnant. Her initial response was a period of sustained anxiety followed by a physical state of exhaustion. She describes this feeling as a dangerous flirtation with hope, a sentiment she previously found inaccessible. During an evening meal, Lena disclosed the pregnancy with blunt efficiency. The subject displayed immediate physical paralysis as he processed the data. His facial musculature betrayed a conflict of numerous competing emotional states as he learned she was 6 weeks along. A tense interrogation regarding their intentions followed the disclosure of the pregnancy. Both subjects acknowledged their lack of appropriate parental conditioning through dark, defensive humor. Adrian's eventual laughter indicates an acceptance of this high-stakes venture and a commitment to the unborn offspring. The subject expressed a desire for a total life integration, regardless of the inherent psychological risks. Lena's somatic tension dissipated upon this confirmation of shared commitment. Adrian's solution to the child's safety is the radical transformation of his entire socio-political environment. While Adrian projected confidence, the actual implementation of this new life was fraught with complexity. Lena's initial trimester was characterized by persistent emesis and significant weight loss. Her psychological profile was dominated by fears of biological failure and maternal inadequacy. Adrian adopted a persona of hypervigilance, subjecting medical staff to rigorous, almost hostile cross-examinations. He interpreted standard professional reassurances as dangerous oversights. For him, the concept of acceptable risk in the context of his family was entirely non-existent. The subject's obsession with risk mitigation led to the installation of advanced medical diagnostic tools within their private residence. He remains convinced that he can engineer a solution to any biological anomaly. His behavior is a classic manifestation of a control-oriented psyche under extreme pressure. Adrian utilizes detailed planning as a stabilizing anchor against his internal terrors. When Lena entered labor at 36 weeks, he entered a state of high-functioning alarm. The biological timeline had deviated from his established parameters, triggering a controlled panic. By Thursday evening, the couple had a daughter who displayed immediate signs of vocal strength and high reactivity. Despite the slightly accelerated gestation period, neonatal assessments were universally positive. The physician noted the infant's exceptional condition and inherited force of will. Adrian remained in a state of behavioral stasis, viewing the infant as a fragile asset he might inadvertently damage. Eventually, he achieved the motor control necessary to hold his daughter. His physical posture was one of extreme caution and profound apprehension. The subject expressed profound astonishment at the neonate's physical dimensions and questioned his own protective efficacy. When the infant achieved visual focus on Adrian, it appeared to solidify the paternal connection. It was a rare moment of unfiltered vulnerability for the former crime boss. A complex vocalization, a merger of relief and sorrow, escaped the subject during this initial bonding. He issued a solemn vow to insulate the child from all external threats. They selected the name Lena, a tribute to the resilience of Lena's own matrilineal line. The criminal network responded with symbolic tributes intended to secure favorable standing with the subject. Alexei Kozlov's gift, a multi-generational heirloom, explicitly framed the child as a future successor within the hierarchy, highlighting the syndicate's obsession with dynastic continuity. Adrian rejects the concept of a mandatory criminal dynasty, preferring to grant the child complete agency. He asserted his willingness to dismantle his entire power structure for the preservation of his family. His conviction regarding their autonomy appears clinically absolute. A second gestation occurred within a 12-month window, catching the couple by surprise. Lena's psychological response showed a significant increase in self-efficacy compared to the first pregnancy. She approached the impending birth with a clinical sense of familiarity rather than her previous terror. The second offspring, a male, arrived 14 days post-term, indicating an early trait of stubborn behavioral resistance. They designated him Marcus, a choice that memorializes a protective figure from Lena's initial period of trauma. The case file remains open. Subject's domestic restructuring serves as a counter-narrative to his developmental trauma. Diana observes the transition from a utilitarian kinship model, where progeny are merely tactical variables, to a more traditional, albeit high-cost, affective environment. Analysis indicates a complete behavioral pivot during parental interactions. Voss, once defined by rigid executive control, now exhibits atypical patience and emotional availability, consciously overcompensating for the paternal neglect that fueled his initial sociopathic leanings. The domestic sphere is characterized by chaotic stimuli, infant vocalizations, and environmental disorder. Subject expresses profound gratitude for his partner's role in his moral recalibration, viewing her as the primary catalyst for his identity shift. Lena's profile has evolved from a state of acute vulnerability to one of significant social agency. She has successfully navigated a complex power dynamic, transforming from an invisible victim into the cornerstone of a restructured criminal corporate hierarchy. The Voss organization is undergoing a deliberate phase shift toward legitimate corporate structures. This necessitates the systematic decoupling from high-risk illicit operations, a process requiring complex negotiation with legacy criminal entities resistant to modernization. Entities failing to adapt to this legalistic framework face inevitable attrition. Subject continues to utilize Victor as a primary surrogate, ensuring the organization's durability beyond his own lifespan, a classic legacy-building maneuver. 5 years post-exile, the subject's sibling was found deceased in Buenos Aires, likely due to self-induced pharmacological toxicity. Voss processes this data with chilling emotional neutrality, indicative of a final psychological severing from his familial origins. The sibling was categorized by the subject not as kin, but as a biological monster. This cold assessment suggests that Victor's violent trajectory was seen as an immutable trait, making his termination a net positive for social stability. The interment was a minimal affair. Discussion regarding the deceased's remorse suggests a lack of moral insight. He likely only regretted the tactical failure of being apprehended. The subject immediately returned to his primary domestic reinforcement loop. Following the sibling's death, the subject's emotional detachment from his past became absolute. The eldest child, Lena, began manifesting high-intelligence traits and assertive boundary setting, characteristic of an alpha-socialized environment. The younger sibling, Marcos, exhibits a more internalized but equally stubborn temperament. The subject employs a strategy of controlled disclosure regarding his violent history, attempting to socialize them through a lens of nuanced moral ambiguity. The subject defends his past violence as a protective mechanism, arguing that ethical transgressions are occasionally necessitated by tribal defense. This complex moral framework is presented to the 9-year-old as an essential, albeit difficult, life lesson. By the time Lena reached 12 and Marcus 10, the organization's metamorphosis was nearly total. Revenue streams are now predominantly anchored in transparent real estate and audited portfolios, effectively insulating the heirs from the subject's prior criminal liabilities. Lena observes the subject's professional conduct with a sense of cognitive relief. She views his shift from destruction to construction as a successful moral rehabilitative process, though his internal capabilities remain largely unchanged. Subject clarifies that his personality remains fundamentally the same. He has merely optimized his choice-making parameters. He credits the collective stability of the family unit as the primary deterrent against his darker impulses. To mark their 10th anniversary, they return to the geographic origin of their partnership. The site, once a location of extreme desperation, now serves as a mnemonic anchor for their shared survival narrative and successful social ascent. The inquiry into regret reveals a selective conscience. While acknowledging the unnecessary fatalities of his previous career, the subject expresses zero remorse for the core decision that initiated his relationship with the victim-turned-partner. Their physical affection in a public space acts as a defiant rejection of their origins. The subject recalls his initial assessment of the partnership as a tactical error, an opinion he now classifies as his most significant misjudgment. The daily schedule remains a dichotomy of high-stakes power brokering and mundane parental duties like soccer games. This functional duality allows them to maintain their status while fostering a semi-normal development for their progeny. Ultimately, their endurance is predicated on a continuous daily reinforcement of their mutual commitment. They have constructed an affective sanctuary that prioritizes internal loyalty over the external metrics of the empire they maintain. Lena transitioned from acute isolation to secure attachment, while Voss found a redirection for his megalomaniac narcissism within the confines of familial protection. Both have achieved a high level of psychological homeostasis despite their hostile environment. While their prior transgressions are indelible, their continued coexistence constitutes a significant victory over their respective traumas. In the final analysis, their survival is a testament to the power of calculated, reciprocal bonding